Good evening, fellow classmates. I'm Professor Rakesh Kumar. My name is Graeme Michael Edwards, student number N01177437, and this is my renewable energy project on hydroelectric power in Canada. Let's begin. What is hydroelectric power, you may ask? Well, here's the definition of hydroelectric power according to the definition dictionary. The process of using flowing water to produce energy. Yes, it is that simple. The three forms of hydroelectric power in Canada that we primarily use, with a bonus example: run-of-the-river hydro, conventional dam hydro, and pump storage hydro. But how does hydroelectricity work? And tidal hydro is the extra one. How does hydroelectric power work? Well, we're actually utilizing flowing water at a high pressure, sometimes all the way up to 30,000 meters squared of pressure in a penstock at a time. So water is stopped at a high altitude, typically 100 meters to 300 meters elevation, and then a concrete or metal wall is slid up, allowing said water to rush through a penstock, which is similar to my arm. It then hits a massive turbine, typically more than one, sometimes up to 20 in China, and then with that turbine turning, it actually connects to a power generator, which makes power, and then that electricity is transferred to the power grid, and in our case this is Canada. The four main provinces that utilize hydroelectric power in Canada are Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and Newfoundland and Labrador. This is an example of how hydroelectric power is produced. Let's begin to the next slide. So the history of hydropower. So I'm just going to run through this very quickly. In 1827, French engineer Benoit Florion, he built a 6 horsepower turbine in a nearby flowing river. He was just walking by one day and he noticed the water's flowing. I could probably utilize this with some simple wooden screws built together. A few years later, 1849, James Francis, another French engineer, developed the first world's water turbine. So this was actually a spinning regiment. In 1870, a gentleman named Lester Pelton made the first water wheel, which will have a single vertical axle and multiple wooden flaps that will rotate around flowing water to produce energy. In 1878, the first hydropower project was built in England. And a few years later, the power project in Ottawa, which is very famous, and in Niagara Falls, Sir Adam Beck Falls, which is the oldest power plant in Canada, was built. A year later, in 1882, in Wisconsin, United States of America, hydropower plant was opened for its first power generation. Moving on to 1905, in China, they opened a 500 kilowatt power plant, which was the largest at its time in 1905. And fun fact for you, today in 2020, we're in the month of April. China actually has a mega hydropower station, which is the largest in the world, and can produce 20,000 gigawatts. It's double the size of anything of its size. By this point, in mid-1900s, most countries around the world have had some form of hydroelectric power. Moving on, you may ask yourself, what are some large hydro power projects in Canada, since we're focusing on our nation? Well, Well, number one is the Daniel Johnson Hydro Dam. This was constructed in 1968 in Quebec and can produce 2,660 megawatts at full capacity. Number two is the WAC, otherwise known as WAC, Bennett Dam. This was opened in 1967 in Peace River, British Columbia, and can produce 2,790 megawatts at full capacity. Number three on our list is the Robert Bourassa Dam, which is actually a neighbor to the Quebec Dam, which is located in a similar field or body of water. That opened in 1981 in Quebec and can produce 5,616 megawatts capacity. That is more than double the first two. Fourth on our list is the Annapolis Royal Generating Station, opened in 1984 in Nova Scotia, and can produce 30 megawatts per kilowatt year. And this particular station, the Royal Generating Station in Nova Scotia, actually utilizes the Bay of Fundy, and this is tidal. So this is our fourth form of hydroelectric power in Canada. Number 5 on our list is the Upper Mamaquan Hydro Dam. This is located in British Columbia as well and can produce 69 kilowatts. It can produce 69 kilowatts. Number 6, Churchill Falls Generating Station. This is in Newfoundland and Labrador and can produce 35,000 gigawatts of power. This is insane. Number 7, as I stated earlier, Sir Adam Beck Power Plant opened in 1922. That's when the restoration was done to it, which added 13 more turbines. It is now at 14 capacity compared to 1881 when it only had 1 turbine. And obviously number 8 on our list, there's many others. There's 475 hydroelectric power plants in the world, and there's a lot in Canada as well. Moving on, what are the advantages of hydroelectric power? Well, I'm about to tell you. It's a renewable energy source. It's a clean source of energy as well. It helps create jobs. Just to expand on this point, it's a renewable energy source because it uses water, and water is abundant around our planet. It's evaporating at a very small pace, and it's going to be around for hundreds of millions of years on our planet unless something catastrophic happens. RIP to the dinosaurs. So every power plant creates jobs as well. So since we're focusing on Canada, the most recent power plant that was open actually used 7,500 construction builders and employees to make. Typically this ranges from 3,000 to 8,000 staff. Talking about that major one in China, 40,000 different engineers and construction workers were utilized. Moving on, it contributes to development of remote communities. So how many times have you heard of Indigenous folk that have had these monstrosities built near their location and they're not able to utilize the power too effectively? Well, these developments of dams in remote communities, especially in northern Ontario near Timmins, there's a couple up there, and also in northern British Columbia near the Peace River, since the power is so local, they're able to expand their community and have fast, reliable hydropower. There's low maintenance fees and operating fees for a hydro dam. A disadvantage of it will be in the next slide, but they're pretty expensive to build. So there's low operating fees and maintenance fees year-round. Typically it's about $1,000 per kilowatt produced, and then those can be sold anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million per kilowatt, which is very impressive for Canada, and the return on investment is very, very fast. So that's the last point there, is that it's flexible, local, and the return on investment is at a high percentage. Moving on, disadvantages of hydropower. So you see this monstrosity and you think, well, that probably costs a lot of money to build. Well, I would agree with you. There's a lot of high upfront costs for these dams, particularly in Canada. They're on the small scale. We have a small pump storage project which costs $10 to $12 million to produce, but that is nothing compared to what some of the costs are for these massive projects. We're looking at $450 million Canadian to build a mid-scale hydro dam, and the one that I talked about a few slides back actually, there's a major dam that is up in British Columbia called Manic 5. So this is really, really far north of the Alaskan Highway and very close to Fort Nelson, which is actually where my father grew up in northern British Columbia. And this is projected to cost about $11.5 billion Canadian. Yes, I said billion. This is an insane amount of money, and that's the major downfall to hydroelectric power. There's a risk of floods and dam failure. Canada hasn't really had that any major dam failures. We have had a few massive floods up in British Columbia, but typically we don't hear about them. But here, this dam failure in China, this occurred in 1975, so it wasn't too long ago actually, it was only 45 years ago. And you can see here that there's a dam failure that produced 26,000 deaths. There was also millions of people, millions of Chinese people that were left homeless. This was a tragedy. There's also displacement, excuse my language, displacement of people in northern Ontario, northern Canada, even Quebec. Focusing on Canada, Richard Thompson, which is one of the authors that I've used his work in my paper, and I've cited as so, he wrote numerous blogs about the advantages and disadvantages of hydropower. Now, quoting one of his papers, Mr. Thompson actually said that due to the fact that the Manic 5 dam was produced in Fort Nelson, there was already a pretty steady crime rate there with a bash between redneck white folk and the indigenous Aboriginal people, but that crime rate is actually the highest in British Columbia and the highest in Canada right now, which is very tragic. So you can see that they're making a lot of money off of the people there, and they're not really supplying enough power, and the men are actually able to get jobs and utilize the power, and they're able to go out, but because they're able to get an education. But unfortunately for the women and children, they're actually living in extreme poverty, and the suicide rate is extremely high. We can't attribute this all to large hydropower dams, but we can attribute a small percent to it. Next on our list is the impact of other locations. When about 150 billion cubic liters of water is stopped at 300 meters in the air. This is a third of a tenth, 30% of a kilometer high in the air. Water is going to be building up an insane pressure, and due to this Manic 5 dam failure that happened in northern British Columbia, just off of the Peace River, which I keep referring to, it actually had a 128 kilometer wide flood. So if you can picture this is 1 kilometer, oh, and there's a few homes in here, which there wasn't, it was mostly wildlife, 128 kilometers of flooding. This is insane, and this is one of the larger ones that we've seen in Canada. There's also the impact of people. So if we're going back to China, there was millions that were displaced, and they even said, you know what, hey, sorry, we're not really going to pay you, but you're going to have to move out of here, sell your home as quickly as you can. No one's going to buy it except for us, and you're going to have to find somewhere else to live. So that's unethical, and that's inhumane, and Canada typically doesn't do that. The main disadvantage of hydroelectric power is actually environmental damage. So there's going to be thousands and thousands of fish species that are going to be cut off. They're not going to be able to migrate upstream and downstream due to the dam failure. If they do, to the dam wall, if they are able to make it to the dam wall, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to get sucked into one of these penstocks, okay, that is about 350 meters raised in the air, and they're going to be going with much velocity and hit these turbines, and they're going to be practically vaporized. There's no fish or living organism that's going to survive getting hit by a turbine. So there's major errors there. Another environmental disadvantage is the fact that when this water is dammed up at high altitude, it is going to flood, like I said earlier, as our example in Peace River, and there's going to be tons of forests, and there's going to be tons of species that are going to be pushed outward, and that's going to take away a lot of their land, especially since most of these hydroelectric power dams can take up to 6,000 miles squared surface area, which is insane. Most of the ones in Canada are actually 3,000 miles squared, but some of the ones around the world are that large. The last disadvantage we have is due to the fact that water is going to be suffocating these ecosystems and these species. There's going to be high amounts of methane and carbon dioxide that are going to be released in the air coming up through the water. That's not a major disadvantage, but that is a notable one. So what is the future of hydroelectric power in Canada? Well, I can tell you that hydroelectric power is the largest source of energy in the world, and more hydroelectric power projects are going to be opening in North America, and they are as we speak. There's many that are under construction. And yes, they do cost a lot, but their return on investment is very high with the amount of power that they can produce locally and provincially and nationally. Developing countries such as, say, India and Yemen, Afghanistan, these countries are all looking into hydroelectric power plants. Although they don't have as much fresh water available that we do, there are running streams and other things like this where they could build dam storage and pump storage and utilize water flowing in order to produce power for themselves in their country. Dams out there, they're built to last as well, as I stated earlier, an advantage. There's some dams that have been around for half a century, and coming up on a full century. These massive concrete structures are built to last, allowing humans to get power. Second last, we have out of sight, out of mind. Hydroelectric power isn't very visible. You know, we typically on our main highway there going out to Niagara Falls, that's typically the only one that we'll see, and maybe a couple in Quebec on our major highways. But for the most part, hydroelectric power is out of sight, and people are thankful for that. And considering they're so big and monstrous, and they utilize the power as we do daily with other green energy. Hydroelectric power is clean, like I said. It is green. There's no emissions, as climate change is a major topic that we've been talking about in our renewable energy class. There's a good return on investment, as I mentioned, and water is abundant in our planet. Thank you for listening. Once again, my name is Graeme Edwards, and I hope that you learned a little bit about hydroelectric power generation in Canada today. Have a great evening.